All right. Hello and welcome. Brett here with clickmill.co. Um, Juke is currently on a flight back to Florida from being out here with us. And so he's not going to make it today, but we are going to pick up where we left off. And so today we are going to cover at least one, maybe two additional arguments that can be made for positions on atheism. So we're going to start with microevolution and macroevolution. Okay, so there are some various different forms of micro and macro evolution. And as we have already discussed, there's chemical evolution, which is how do we get the first strand of DNA? It's just chemicals. There is no evolving over time. It either falls together and it works or it does not. You have to have a fully functioning cell. You have to have the fully functioning piece of DNA simultaneously, which is impossible, basically. So that's chemical evolution. You then have Darwinian evolution, which is the position that they would take. And Darwinian evolution, as we've already discussed, assumes naturalism, or that everything evolves through natural process. So there is nothing supernatural. There is no metaphysical. There's only natural processes. So you now have to, it is now your burden to show how life comes to be the way that it is without any miraculous intervention. And of course, you've been seeing they must show beyond, what do you want to say, in a way that is more likely than any other narrative, be it Christian or Jewish or Buddhist or any other religion. They have to show that their interpretation of reality is more likely than the rest. And that includes the Big Bang, that includes all the natural processes, and that then goes into Darwinian evolution, which is, yeah, chemical evolutions. I'm looking at my notes. Chemical evolution happened. Sure, it was a crazy chance, but here we are. That's the argument that we have for that. And then beyond that, as it continues, we evolve. One thing evolves to the next thing, the tree of life. You're welcome to look up the evolutionary tree of life. And, the single-celled organism evolved into multi-cells, evolved into a clam, evolved into a, whatever, into a monkey, into a man, and here we all are. And they have to show this, and that is Darwinian evolution, or the Darwinian evolutionary tree of life. You can look that up. Now, one of the major pushbacks to this is what we might call microevolution versus macroevolution. Now, macroevolution is what more or less Darwinians and Darwinian evolutionists will push. And they will say one kind of thing can evolve through slow change over time into a different kind of thing. And so this would be, a salamander can evolve into a lizard because, well, look at their bones. For example, whales have 5 boned fingers, phalanges in their fins. And so do salamanders. So, the whale evolved into a marsh-like creature that crawled up on the land, and now we have a lizard which has this many bones. And so they're looking for similarities in bone structure, and that is how we get the, more or less evolutionary tree of life. There's, of course, more that goes into it, but that's the type of reasoning we're using. We're looking at fossils, we're comparing skeletal structures and what are called morphological structures, morphology being the study of how the form of the body looks. And then they're assessing what kinds are most similar, and then they're assuming macroevolution, one kind to the next kind until you get to humans. So naturally, of course, monkeys then evolved into whatever intermediary species into human. Now, that is macroevolution. How can we assume macroevolution? The atheist, you doing all right so far, Zach? I'm sorry, I know it's just you and me today, and I'm filming for course, and I feel like I'm just talking at you, but whatever. We'll talk more. I'll get through this and we'll talk more on this one.
Yeah.
So how do the Darwinian evolutionists and they wouldn't, I don't think, call themselves macro because they're just assuming Darwinian is the case. Believers in a lot of religions, including Christianity, would break this down and say, you've got to show a couple things here to get to the Darwinian side. So the first thing that they would rely on is the similarity in certain types of morphological structures or skeletal structures and the what do you want to say? The fossil record, these types of things. So, they'd say, well, based on the structure of these organisms, life started in the ocean because that's where we sort of start to see a lot of the sea sponges in the Precambrian fossil period. And then we get the Cambrian explosion. But even within that, it seems like the smaller creatures are on the bottom. So look, we're getting more advanced. And so they're going to use the structure of the body and the skeletal structure. They're also going to use evidence, and this, when they say, well, we've proven evolution disproves the need for God and all this stuff and a creation event. And so, for example, Charles Darwin goes to, I believe, the Galapagos Islands and is looking at different species of finches, and he is seeing that it's basically the same type of finch, except the beak is a little longer and the beak is a little shorter on one island to the next island. And he's looking at, well, why would these beaks be longer or shorter? Well, because the bark of the tree is is thicker or thinner on certain islands. So the actual physical needs of those finches is different. And so over generations, they adapt to their environment and that is evolution. And then the question then is, well, I guess what they do from that point is that they say, well, we can see that there is slow change over time. And because of this, when you have enough slow change over time, the salamander becomes a lizard, becomes a I don't know, a dog or whatever the tree of life does. And this doesn't necessarily follow. And so the microevolutionary perspective that a lot of theists, and especially Christian theists, would take would be to say that, yes, a bird or a species of bird can change over time. And this isn't really arguable. When you take two different types of dogs and you breed them, you get maybe a new dog. That's how we have all the dogs we have. I mean, that's just how this works. So that is shown. But despite breeding dogs for 5,000 years, they've been domesticated at least, there has never been a dog that has micro evolved into anything other than a different type of dog. So what the actual evidence would seem to imply is that there is a genetic limitation on how far any creature can evolve, and specifically it can micro evolve within its own kind. So a dog can micro evolve to environmental circumstances or to meet the needs of, the specific breeders of that dog. Short hair, long hair, big, small, whatever, pugs with ugly short snouts, whatever. But a dog never became a cat. And there is no evidence of that ever happening. And so the evidence is lacking to show a kind ever becoming a different kind. And that is where we will reference intermediary fossils, which, well, we don't really have those. But even beyond that, the rebuttal that I have most commonly heard from the Darwinists or the evolutionists or atheists or whoever you want to kind of reference is, well, of course we haven't observed it because it happens on such a slow evolutionary timescale that we wouldn't have even been around to observe it. So yeah, dogs can become different kinds of dogs, but they could evolve into other things, but, it's just a rare event. And not only that, it takes so long for new structures to happen through more, what do you want to say? Basically fancy mutations, novel mutations in the genetic code and physical morphological structures, whatever. It's going to take a lot longer. And of course, because we haven't even been recording this stuff. So even if it did happen during recorded human history, we might not even know about it. So we don't know. And, that is an argument from ignorance, and that's not an argument. That is a faith. That is a position of faith. There is no evidence to account for that position, which is, in my opinion, a weaker argument than to say, based on what we can see, we have not seen any transition between the kinds, a dog to not a dog. And their position would be, well, it just takes a long time. And that's the answer to all of the issues, or maybe I won't say all, but we'll say many of the issues in the atheistic, naturalistic, physicalistic worldview is what you just need more time, and we haven't seen it. And I think one of the points that I will point out to that argument is that this is sort of a God of the gaps argument. When Christians say, well, we don't have the answer because, God. And then it's like, well, okay, you're making a God of the gaps argument. We're going to fill that in. This is kind of an evolution of the gaps argument. Well, we just don't know because, it really just takes a long time. And okay, well, that's kind of the same point. And we're not allowed to use sort of God of the gaps arguments, but we can use evolution of the gaps argument. Evolution explains it. We just don't really have any evidence or proof of it right now, but it'll fill in later. And I think that that's a little bit of a double standard that is used in there as well. Michael's trying to get in.
It's often similarly the case that the natural selection will be used to fill gaps in as well, more specifically because there will be questions regarding specific adaptations or evolutions. And then when there's not a sufficient answer that can be posited at the time, it's explained away with natural selection. Well, it had a purpose, or it does, and it fulfilled its purpose, and that's why it's different, as opposed to maybe there's just different kinds.
Yes. And I think, again, all of that, like, could that be the case? Sure, it could have been the case that there was a necessity for this theoretical, whatever. But do we know? No, we don't know. It's a theory. And if we're basing our science on theory, great. I can have a theory that there is an intelligent designer. And then the question is based on the available data, in lack of direct evidence or proof of some kind, and in without a law, I guess what we would say in science, you'd say a scientific law, in place of something actually being 100% proven, you have to assess the validity of two theories, there being an intelligent designer or evolution having change of kinds, and you have to assess what you believe is more likely. Yeah, did you have more to say on that, Zach?
Yeah, well, it's presented empirically, but it's not. It's like you just said, it's theoretical and specifically pointing to the God of the gaps thing and the comparative version of that being kind of evolution of the gaps or using natural selection to backfill where we don't understand things.
Yes.
It's fine to put that forth as long as we're being intellectually honest and saying we don't know, but this is a possible reason why. So
it's great. Yeah. And in terms of micro, macro evolution, there are various positions that Christians take. One, I personally, I would not lean toward. I know different people do, but you do have theistic evolution, which is God set up all the initial conditions of the universe and planned for full-on Darwinian evolution to take place. And it was Darwinian evolution, and we do come from clams and mollusks, and everything actually did take place in this sort of I guess we could call it a naturalistic way because it all did come through a natural process, but God started the initial, we might say God banged the Big Bang and then everything else was planned by him, but not directly influenced. So that would be theistic evolution. I personally don't fall that way because, and again, this comes down to interpretation of Genesis, but when Genesis says there was no sin or death, I think if you're looking at something like that with a large what am I saying? Darwinian sort of time frame, there was death. There was death of all kinds of things. And then we're reinterpreting that death to mean death of humans and sin of humans type of thing. So I don't know. I don't personally fall that way. Not say that couldn't be the case. There is a book on that called Theistic Evolution, which is like a huge 1,000-page brick. I know Juke has something to say. Maybe we'll get his thoughts next week when he's here. He's still on his way home from visiting. So that's theistic evolution. You can also have what we might call a theistic microevolutionary stance, which is probably where I fall. And, happy to, you guys are welcome to share your thoughts as well. I fall probably more to the theistic microevolutionary view, which I would probably take a more literal interpretation of Genesis personally. God created. How long did creation take? I really don't know. But I would probably align with the idea that God created the kinds. So he created some dogs, he created some cats, within those cats was a genetic structure that was capable and had within it the ability to evolve already planned in it, to the degree that a cat is always a cat. So you can get all kinds of cats from the initial sort of morphological structure of cats, whatever those were. Maybe they were saber-tooth tigers. I don't know. But from the two initial cats, you get all of the kinds of cats and the variety of cats we see today, because the genetic, and this is something they've also found within genetic coding, to my understanding up to this point, is there's actually multiple layers of code. It's not just like you'd think, a line of zeros and ones. One layer of code might define the physical shape of the animal, or the color of the hair, or the instincts, something like that. But another layer of the code can determine how far that code can change over time and the ways in which it is allowed to change. So you can have sort of multiple layers of code, and there's a name for that, which I cannot recall off the top of my head. I don't know if you remember that, Zach. No, don't worry about it. But either way, so a theistic microevolutionary perspective would say, well, God created the initial kinds, as the book of Genesis would say, in sort of a literal interpretation of that. And the kinds then microevolved into what we see today, but a bear's always a bear, and a dog's always a dog, and the bear never evolved into a dog. And something like that would probably be where I lean. I personally think that it is less likely that evolution happened in the Darwinian sense, clams becoming mans, than God creating kinds and allowing them to evolve within their kinds. And I think that also comes from collective arguments from the Kalam and the teleological and chemical evolution. I don't think, and I think specifically chemical evolution, I don't know how you even have life in a naturalistic or Darwinian sense if you have to have DNA and the cell fall together by chance. It's impossible. I just don't understand that. I think that's so unlikely. So I tend to fall more toward the microevolutionary perspective as opposed to a macro, because I just think, especially with the chemical evolution, it's so unlikely. I can't get on board with it. So that's my perspective. So you got the theistic evolutionary perspective, you've got the theistic microevolutionary perspective. Those are the two I'm familiar with. I think that might be the only two, but I'll open it up. Zach, any thoughts? And Michael, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
I've been reading up a little bit on something. I'm not going to talk about it very long, but it's called the third way. It's meant to be as a alternative to the two that currently exist, which is Darwinian evolution and then creationism. And the third way, because Darwinian evolution is hinged upon survival of the fittest, right? So it's
Yes.
hinged on natural selection. And like I said, there's lots of traits, features that are questioned. And it's like, well, where's the utility here? Because natural selection is utilitarian in nature. And
Right.
so then, well, it was useful for some reason at some point in time.
That
So
we
it's not
don't know about.
empirical. And yeah, it's basically like the God of the gaps,
Okay.
similar concept there. The third way, and I think that it was not actually hypothesized for the sake of creationism, but I think it can go hand in hand. The third way references the stuff that you're talking about, where you have the ability, like it's built into our code, the ability to, on the outskirts in the less important areas. So like for instance, your eyeball is not going to mutate into a new structure because it's critically important,
Right.
but maybe the pigment of your skin
Right.
is more likely to mutate a couple generations down the line if you move to a place that has
Hotter sun.
extraordinarily, yeah, exactly, a hotter sun. So that third way is referencing the built-in structures that allow the code that's built in that allows for new coding,
Right.
and basically using that as a reason to explain the validity of evolution. But because
Which type of
microevolution and
evolution? Micro or macro or both?
it's meant for macro, but it works for both because they're both the same process. It's just that micro and macro, there's dividing lines between
Yeah.
what can or cannot morph into the next. And then I had couple of thoughts. So when we're talking about how that code prioritizes certain structures over others, so like for instance, the eyeball, which will never ever mutate into a new thing in any short period of time. How does the code, how would the code know what to prioritize and what not to? The amount of time you would need to test new things and for those things that have been newly created to become a part of like more of the back end, right?
Well,
I'm just, those are thoughts that are coming to me. It's like, it's interesting that it
Yeah.
would know
I have no
where
idea.
to place the value and priority. Well,
Well,
yeah, that's the point, right?
Darwinian answer is easy. The Darwinian answer would be, well, all of the, let's say, finch species, all of them are evolving in a micro sense at any given time. And all of the ones that don't get the longer beak when they fly over to this other island with trees with thicker bark, all of the ones that don't get a longer beak just die. So it's just pure random and unguided chance. That would be the Darwinian example of that. In the sort of theistic microevolutionary sense, what is the mechanism that tells the sort of genetic code in which way to alter? I don't know. Maybe it's random chance. Or maybe there is an actual mechanism. I would have to read more on that. I don't know. That goes a little bit beyond my
Well,
knowledge.
yeah, well, what I was saying, and it wasn't a question meant for you to answer, but
Mhm.
it's more of a thought-provoking question in the
Yeah.
sense that why would we have certain parts of our body that are integral to our success and thriving
Mhm.
that are again on the back end of the code, so to speak, right? That are not going to be messed around with, not going to be played with, like the shape of your femur or whatever. It's not gonna randomly chop 6 inches off for one of your kids because
Right.
it just wants to try that out.
Right.
Well, um, you would have to wonder how that value was placed there, like what had to happen along the way for that to work its way. And of course, the natural selection, that where you're talking about the survival of the fittest, would say, well, one had the beak that was this long and this long, this long, and then the one that had the correct size and
Mhm.
strength and rigidity or whatever was the one that survived, and then it propagated, and
Yes.
that's great. But then we have to look at where some of the features actually have that utility. Anyways, it was just a thought because what we would say probably, right, is that God placed the values, and
Yeah.
so he put protections around
Yes.
this
Here's
line
a
of code.
design within the code. Yes. Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think if you reject chemical evolution, which we discussed in prior weeks, if you reject the idea that 30,000 books or 1,030 volume encyclopedias, according to Richard Dawkins, of information just fell together into a simple piece of DNA, and then that miraculously fell together into some nanotechnology, which itself fell together as a cell, and all of that happened. If you reject that, then the coding has to be designed, unless there's an explanation to how you get your first single-celled organism, which is the first life. Unless you can explain that, I don't know how you get to a place naturally where you would have to have a design for something that looks designed, and that would obviously be the way in which we're falling. So yeah, I think that is a further kind of logical process to the teleological argument, which is the argument from design.
It also fits in nicely. Just a quick thought, because I'm looking at a picture over here that's got the homologies of the various um, forelimbs for different vertebrates, right? So it's got turtles, whales, bats, humans, all these birds, and how they all have the fingers and the I'm not going to know the technical names for the bones, but like your knuckles, your joints, like all of them have the same bones.
Yeah.
And they're just placed differently. Well, if intelligence design is brought into play there, we're looking at, okay, we can acknowledge that the coding has certain elements to it that are protected because they work really, really well and they should not be messed with. Presumably, you would say, well, these shapes, right, of the bones, these systems work really, really well. And so they're modified, but they're not changed wholly because they work well.
Right.
And as such have utility across species.
Yes.
So even though a whale doesn't have fingers, it maybe makes more sense for it to have the
Mhm.
finger bones as opposed to maybe just like a flat plate or something. I'm thinking out loud here.
I
But
think maybe something in the same vein of that is, what is a mutation? The way that evolutionists or Darwinian evolutionists have to think about mutations is as an addition of meaningful information. That's how we got to be humans, by adding meaningful information to the clam and getting a fish, and then adding meaningful coded information into a fish, and over time, natural selection. Well, what do we actually see with mutations? When you actually see a mutation, you have never seen someone running around with a fifth or a third arm coming out of their back that's like super helpful, and they're like, I'm so happy about this. No, when you have a mutation, it is a degradation, it is a breaking of the code, and sometimes that is functional. Like, there was a bank robber, I think early 1900s, who had two thumbs, something like that, and he could count money super fast, and it was a functional thumb. It is still a lack of meaningful information, not an addition. And so that works against the Darwinian evolutionary theory, because you have to have more coded information. Well, you know, again, the argument against that is, well, the reason why we see so many negative mutations that actually hurt life is because, look, evolution's happening, and we just have to have a lot of chance, and you just see the good ones so rarely because they're rare. How do you improve on a human? That's going to be hard to do because we've already been improved from the clams so many times. So yeah, of course, most of the mutations are breaking things, but time and chance. And now we're back again to just faith in time and chance, as opposed to faith in a designer. And maybe alternatively to that, when we're discussing a biblical perspective on evolution, what you see, if you at least take generally Genesis, when you take Genesis more literally, and there is an actual creation event, God creates in a state of perfection in the garden. And if that is the case, then what you would expect to see is actually genes devolving. And so if it is the case that you have sort of this evolutionary micro, what do you want to say, theistic microevolution, and God creates the kinds, those kinds are actually devolving over time. More and more genetic abnormalities are being accumulated in the genome over time, and there's evidence for this in genetics. I think, if I remember correctly, and I forget which author this is, maybe I can have Juke speak to this, but every generation there's something like 100 more negative genetic mutations in the genome. And based on this, they can actually run calculations to assess the age of the human genome broadly. They can use it also. They can look at this sort of thing and see how many women the human genetic code came from. And from what I've seen, it's one, which is very weird. So there's so even when you look at the genetics from a biblical perspective, there's a lot of alignment. It seems to be degrading over time, not increasing in complexity. It seems that people come from one person, so on and so forth. And I will see if we can't get some of those sources in the description of this as well. So anyway, I'll throw it back to you guys. Any thoughts or anything? Michael, how you feeling? Is there anything new here? Anything you haven't heard? Anything you don't like?
No. Actually, the science part, some of the things you're mentioning, they are new, but it's good, man. I'm learning things, on a new perspective.
Love it. Yeah, it's cool. It's not that, any of this is necessary for believers, but it's really cool to have it with you when people start to ask you difficult questions, because you're like, yeah, I really just think it takes more faith to be an atheist than to be a Christian, and it's just so much easier to believe in a God. And they're like, what are you talking about? And then you can get into some of this and you show them, like with the cosmological argument, you believe the universe came from an infinite number of other universes? Well, how do you explain an infinite number of universes now? I just think God made it. Well, where'd God come from? And then my answer to that is, God didn't come from anywhere. He's eternal. God is uncreated. And then he created something that is a logically consistent answer. And then they have to then tell you where all of their universes came from, and they have to make up something else. That is a broader faith claim than just positing an uncreated creator. I believe like Aristotle, right? He just said you have to have an uncaused cause at some point. And the atheists don't have any grounds for an uncaused cause. So, well, I think this is a good overview of micro versus macro evolution and how that applies to maybe how a Darwinian evolutionist or a naturalist might see this. I will go ahead and stop recording on this one. We'll move into the next one.